On the morning of May 11th, 1945, the USS Bunker Hill was not just an aircraft carrier. It was a loaded weapon. 34 American planes sat packed across her flight deck, fueled, armed, engines warming, bombs under wings, gasoline in lines, ammunition stacked into the morning routine. At 10:02, a Japanese Zero dropped out of the low cloud. The first bomb punched through the deck and exploded outside the hull. Then the airplane hit. 30 seconds later, a second Zero came in. This one was flown by a young pilot named Kiyoshi Ogawa. His aircraft struck near the island's superstructure, where the command spaces were, and the fire from the first impact met the fire from the second. The deck became a chain reaction. Parked aircraft burned in rows. Rockets and machine gun ammunition cooked off. Pilots, trapped below the flight deck, died in rooms that had been ordinary waiting spaces 1 minute earlier. By the time the smoke began to thin, 396 men were dead. And Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher had lost more than a ship. He had lost his flag cabin, his papers, his uniforms, the few personal possessions he had carried through 2 months at sea. He had also lost 14 men from his own staff, 3 officers, 11 enlisted men. His headquarters had turned to ash. That evening, wearing a borrowed cap, sitting on a borrowed flagship, his face hollow from 60 days of combat, Mitscher gave the order nobody outside that war would have expected. He did not pull the carriers south. He did not wait for the next wave. He sent them north, toward Japan, toward the airfields that had just burned his flagship. And the reason he did that starts underground, in a cave on Kyushu, with another vice admiral who was spending his country's last airplanes like currency in a fire. His name was Matome Ugaki. By the fall of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer the navy that had opened the Pacific War. Leyte Gulf had broken the surface fleet. Japan had lost the ships it needed to meet the Americans in a conventional sea battle. The big carriers were gone or useless. Fuel was vanishing. Experienced pilots were vanishing even faster. The men who had flown the early war, the men who knew how to find a fleet, attack it, and live long enough to come home, were mostly dead. What remained were young men pulled from schools and factories, rushed through training, and handed aircraft they barely had time to understand. Some reached combat units with fewer than 150 hours in the air. An American naval aviator could have 3 times that before he reached the front. So Japan faced a brutal calculation. A conventional attack might send hundreds of aircraft toward an American task force. Most would die before they ever reached the ships. The few that survived would still have to aim, drop, pull away, and escape through anti-aircraft fire. The numbers did not work. But suicide attack changed the equation. The airplane no longer had to survive. It only had to arrive. That was the terrible clarity behind the kamikaze. Not mysticism first, arithmetic. On October 25, 1944, organized suicide attacks hit American escort carriers off Leyte. USS St. Lo was struck and sank within the hour. The weapon had proved what it was designed to prove: 1 pilot, 1 airplane, 1 direct hit. After that, the program grew into a campaign, and by early 1945, the man directing much of that campaign was Ugaki, commander of Japan's 5th Air Fleet. He was 55 years old, tall, disciplined, intelligent, and far less blind than many of the officers around him. He had understood Guadalcanal earlier than most. He had understood Midway more clearly than most were willing to admit. He had served under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, and he had been in the air on the mission that killed Yamamoto in 1943. American fighters found Yamamoto's transport over Bougainville. Ugaki survived in another plane. Yamamoto did not. That fact followed him into the cave. Ugaki kept a diary. He wrote about weather, moonlight, duty, grief, and the fate of the empire. Some entries were precise, some were poetic, some were cold enough to feel written by a man trying not to look at what his own orders meant. His headquarters on Kyushu was not a grand command room. It was a cave cut into a hillside, chosen because American B-29s were now reaching the home islands. From that cave, Ugaki could not see the American ships. He could not see the young pilots when their airplanes disappeared over the sea. He saw reports, claims, weather notes, damage estimates, lists of supposed enemy carriers sunk, and he kept sending more men out. That is the contradiction at the center of him. He disliked the suicide weapon. He wrote as if he intended to die with his pilots one day. And still, he commanded the machine that sent those pilots ahead of him. He built his own death into the system, then made thousands of others go first. The campaign had a name, Operation Kikusui, Chrysanthemum Water. It began in force around Okinawa in April 1945, because Okinawa was the last great stepping stone before Japan itself. If the Americans took it, they would have airfields, harbors, staging areas, and a forward base close enough to make the home islands feel the next invasion breathing. So Japan threw aircraft at the fleet in waves. Not a raid, not a desperate one-day gesture. A rhythm. Kikusui 1, Kikusui 2, Kikusui 3. Again and again. Admiral Chester Nimitz found a grim phrase for the cost around Okinawa. A ship and a half a day. Not poetry, accounting. The first mass wave on April 6th sent hundreds of aircraft into the battle, including hundreds assigned to suicide attack. Ships went down. Many more were damaged. Destroyers on radar picket duty were hit again and again because they were stationed far from the main fleet, out where the first warning came. Those destroyers were the tripwire. They were also the shield. 50 to 80 miles from the carriers, they waited for dots on radar that could become aircraft in minutes. Some came back with their superstructures torn open and whole gun crews missing. Some did not come back at all. And still, the picket line had to be manned, because without it, the carriers and transports closer to Okinawa would be exposed. Task Force 58 tried to kill the problem at its source. In March 1945, before the Okinawa landings, American fast carriers raced north toward Kyushu. The plan was simple: strike the airfields before the kamikazes could launch. But the Japanese had warning. Aircraft were dispersed. Runways were nearly empty. The American strike groups hit fields that had already been cleared. And while those American planes were attacking the land, Japanese aircraft were slipping out through cloud and coming for the carriers. USS Franklin was hit on March 19th. 2 bombs from a single Japanese aircraft turned her flight deck into an inferno. Fires reached armed planes. Bombs detonated inside the ship. More than 700 men died. Franklin survived. Barely. She was towed away and never returned to combat. The lesson was ugly. Daylight strikes gave the Japanese time to move. The fleet could not simply bomb runways and assume the weapon was gone. By May, Task Force 58 had been operating for almost 2 straight months. The crews were exhausted. The pilots were exhausted. The ships were worn down by launch cycles, combat air patrols, anti-aircraft alarms, and the knowledge that every quiet hour might be the hour before the next dive. But they could not leave. The soldiers and Marines fighting across Okinawa needed the sea lanes open. The fleet was the supply line. The fleet was the shield. Then came May 11th. Kikusui 6 was assembling on Kyushu. More than 300 aircraft were available for the wave, with dozens assigned to suicide attack. The weather helped them. Low, broken cloud hung over the sea. A diving airplane could hide in that ceiling until it was almost on top of its target. On Bunker Hill, the launch was already being prepared. 34 planes on deck, fuel lines, bombs, rockets. Men moving through a routine they had repeated so many times that danger had become part of the working air. The first Zero came out of the cloud at 10:02. Its bomb tore through the carrier and detonated outside. The plane itself slammed into the flight deck and ripped through parked aircraft. Fire spread instantly. Then Kiyoshi Ogawa arrived. He was a university graduate, drafted the previous year, trained quickly, and sent into a mission where landing skill did not matter because there would be no landing. He was barely more than a student. Now he had an American carrier filling the windscreen. His final transmission said he was beginning his dive. His bomb hit near the island. His Zero followed. A wing broke loose and tore through the flag office. Below the flight deck, ready rooms became death chambers. On the deck, the fire found gasoline and ammunition. Inside the smoke, rescue teams moved by touch, sometimes finding shipmates only when they bumped into bodies in the dark. Mitscher lived. Arleigh Burke, his chief of staff, lived by inches. The staff spaces around them were gone. By late afternoon, Mitscher transferred by breeches buoy to the destroyer USS English, the wounded carrier still burning behind him. Then he moved again, this time to Enterprise. Enterprise became his new flagship, a borrowed command post for a man whose flag had just been burned off the sea. Mitscher was not a theatrical commander. He was quiet. He often spoke so softly that men leaned toward him to hear. He wore his long-billed cap low. He sat in a chair backward on the flag bridge. He had a dry, worn look that made 60 days of carrier war visible in his face. But his pilots trusted him because he did not spend them cheaply. He knew what he was asking, and that evening he asked again. Burke argued the case, not revenge, calculation. The Kyushu airfields were the source. The rhythm had to be broken. If the fleet waited, the next Kikusui wave would come on its own schedule. If the carriers moved north, they might force the Japanese Air Command to lose time, aircraft, repair crews, and control. That was the narrow opening. Hit the fields at night. Hit them before the planes could get airborne. Make the enemy react. Mitscher gave the order. Task Groups 58.1 and 58.3 turned north in the dark. Enterprise led them. She had become the fleet's night carrier, the ship most practiced at launching and recovering aircraft after sunset. Now that skill became something larger than a technical advantage. It became the answer to the cave on Kyushu. The carriers moved through darkness toward the island that had been feeding the divine wind. On Kyushu, the airfields were not abstract points on a chart. Kanoya, Kagoshima, Kokubu, Oita. Runways, revetments, fuel stores, ground crews. Airframes hidden where they could be hidden, moved when they could be moved, repaired when there was still time. At night, the surrounding fields were quiet. Rice paddies held the spring warmth. Insects moved in the dark. Then the American planes arrived. Before dawn on May 14th, carrier aircraft struck the Kyushu airfields. This time, the timing was the weapon, not just bombs, timing. The Japanese planes were on the ground. Crews were not in full daylight motion. Repair teams were not yet working under the normal rhythm of the day. Delayed action bombs made runways and work areas dangerous after the first explosions had passed. The raids continued into the next days. Fighter sweeps, bombing runs, fuel burning, taxiways cut, aircraft destroyed in revetments, runways cratered where they had to be repaired before another mass wave could move. Did the attack wipe out the kamikaze force? No. Japan still had aircraft. It still had pilots. It still had fields. No two-day strike could erase the entire system. But that was not the real victory. The victory was rhythm. Kikusui 6 had hit on May 11th. The next massed wave was expected within days. It did not arrive on schedule. Kikusui 7 did not strike the American fleet until May 24th, 13 days. 13 days in which the radar picket destroyers were not hit by another massed wave on that scale. 13 days in which damaged ships could repair what could be repaired. 13 days in which exhausted crews could breathe, reload, reorganize, and keep the Okinawa operations supplied. 13 days is not the kind of victory that looks clean on a map. It is not a surrender. It is not a flag raised over a capital. It is a gap. But in a campaign where ships were being lost and damaged almost daily, a gap could save lives. Still, the weapon did not simply vanish. On May 14th, the same day American planes were hitting the airfields, another kamikaze broke through and hit Enterprise. A bomb exploded through her flight deck forward of the island. Mitscher had to move again, this time to USS Randolph. Randolph had already been damaged by a long-range kamikaze attack at Ulithi weeks earlier. Bunker Hill, Enterprise, Randolph. 3 flagships touched by the same weapon. The admiral hunting the kamikaze could not find a command ship the kamikaze had not already found. There was a cruel orderliness to it. The weapon kept returning, even while the system behind it was being disrupted. From Ugaki's cave, however, the war looked different. The reports reaching him told a story that was not true. Pilots claimed carriers sunk, battleships burning, major ships destroyed. Those claims moved upward through the command structure, became figures, became confidence, became a version of reality Tokyo wanted to believe. At Okinawa, kamikazes sank destroyers, escort carriers, and smaller vessels. They killed thousands of naval personnel. They inflicted terror, damage, and grief. But they did not sink a single American fleet carrier, not one battleship, not one cruiser. The ships designed to project American sea power kept operating because the United States had built a fleet large enough to absorb damage and replace loss at a scale Japan could not match. By 1945, America was building and repairing ships faster than Japan could destroy them. Ugaki was fighting an industrial fact with a spiritual slogan and a broken feedback loop. His diary shows the danger of that loop. In April, after President Franklin Roosevelt died in Georgia of a cerebral hemorrhage, Ugaki wrote as if Japanese attacks might have caused the death. The president had died thousands of miles from the battle, but inside the cave, the reports were all he had, and the reports rewarded belief. So the myth fed itself. The divine wind was winning. The fleet was breaking. The empire still had a path. Except Ugaki also knew another truth. Every aircraft he launched at Okinawa was one less aircraft for the invasion he expected on Kyushu. Japan was preparing Operation Ketsugo, the final defense of the home islands. The plan depended on masses of aircraft, suicide boats, and ground forces hitting the invasion at the moment it came ashore. Ugaki needed planes for that. He was hiding them, saving them, counting them, and spending them. He was eating the future to fight a present he could not win. That is what makes the story more than a clash of commanders. Mitscher lost ships and men, then attacked the mechanism. Ugaki lost reality, then kept feeding the mechanism. One admiral used violence to interrupt a rhythm. The other used sacrifice to preserve an illusion. By August 1945, the illusion had nowhere left to go. Hiroshima had been destroyed, Nagasaki had been destroyed. On August 15th, the Emperor's voice came over the radio, announcing Japan's surrender in court language many listeners struggled to understand. Ugaki heard it through static at an airbase on Kyushu. He knew enough. He wrote his final diary entry. Then he removed the rank insignia from his uniform. He kept his binoculars. He took the short sword Yamamoto had given him. On the flight line, 11 aircraft were ready for a final suicide sortie. One of the men assigned to fly was Warrant Officer Akiyoshi Endo. Ugaki took his place. Endo protested, then climbed in anyway, forcing himself into the cramped aircraft rather than surrender his mission. 3 men crowded into a cockpit meant for 2. The engine turned. Evening settled over Kyushu. At 7:24 p.m., the final radio message said the plane had begun its dive. The war had ended at noon. The last kamikaze tried to fly after surrender. No American record shows a successful attack that night. The next morning, wreckage was found on a beach at Ihejima off Okinawa. 3 bodies. One wore a dark green uniform with the rank removed. A short sword lay nearby in the sand. American sailors buried them where they found them. No ceremony, no title, no empire. Only wreckage, smoke, and a weapon that had outlived the war by a few hours. At surrender, Japan still had more than 9,000 aircraft hidden across the home islands. Thousands had been modified for suicide attack, waiting for an invasion that never came. The kamikazes had not saved Japan. They had not destroyed the American fleet. They had burned ships, killed men, delayed operations, and terrified crews who had to keep working under the shadow of another dive. But in the end, the divine wind ran into something it could not turn. Distance, production, radar, repair crews, night carriers, and commanders who understood that sometimes the only answer to a fire is not to retreat from it. Sometimes the answer is to sail into the dark and burn the source.